Good morning, and welcome. Nice to be back after being gone for a while. So, most recently I was at Spirit Rock teaching a week-long retreat. And I'll be here this week, and then I'm going off to teach another retreat next Sunday. So it is poignant for me to be back. I appreciate so much the opportunity to do this teaching and to be with all of you on YouTube and see your names in the chat. Thank you very much. So during this week, I'd like to generally continue with the topic of compassion that I've done the last few weeks that I've been here. And as we begin today for a guided meditation, I would like to suggest a way of beginning that may come as a bit of a surprise to mindfulness practitioners. And that is to begin by thinking, rather than putting your thinking aside and not giving it any role for this practice. Begin with thinking for just maybe a minute or two to think about how you are right now. Not just, how are you, but to think about it. What is it really, and how is it, and what might be a wise way of being with yourself the way you are? What might be a useful way to practice, given how you are? What might be a useful posture to be in for meditation? If you're tense, maybe a more relaxed posture. If you're tired, maybe a more alert, upright posture. If you're aware of how you are feeling emotionally, what would be a useful attitude to have as you meditate? So these are all questions you can ask yourself. Questions that attune yourself to what's happening for you and how to meet it in practice, how to include it, or how to maybe even what to ignore at times because it's not really to the point. Maybe if you're mostly concerned about dinner menus for the rest of the week, maybe you don't have to spend meditation thinking about those menus. But maybe there's some anxiety underneath those thoughts. So to think about and recognize what's happening here. And if there is anxiety, what would be useful? So I encourage you to spend about 2 minutes now just thinking about what's happening, how to be with it, as a way of attuning yourself, dialing in preparation for meditation. And then if you are concerned with some challenge in your life, and you're thinking about it, is the thinking somehow identified or entangled with the story, the events, the situation? Are there stories that are self-critical or involve self-pity, feeling sorry for yourself? What kind of thoughts do you have if you're aware, concerned with some challenge? And then see if you can step away a little bit and look upon what's happening with the challenge or thoughts, and take a minute or so to think about it as an objective observer, not identified, not critical, not wanting anything or not wanting anything, just thinking about it, looking upon it objectively, thinking about, given that this is going on, what's a useful way to practice with it? What's a useful way to meditate? Maybe it's to put it aside for now and return to it later when you're more centered. And now, having spent some time thinking, let the thinking mind rest. Let it relax. It's done its job, and now it does not need it so much. And now take some long, slow, deep breaths. And as you exhale, to relax into the body. And letting your breathing return to normal. And again, as on the exhale, softening, relaxing the tensions in the body. As you exhale, calming the thinking mind. As you exhale, letting the mind rest in the body. The mind does not have to work so much. Let it rest in the body. With awareness centered in the breathing, the rhythm of breathing. So then as we come to the end of the sitting, let yourself think again freely about whatever benefit that has come from this minute sitting meditating. Are you more self-aware? Are you calmer? Are you more centered, more grounded? Is your heart more open? Maybe you're not so aware of specifics, but you appreciate the opportunity to meditate. And imagine what it'd be like, think about what it'd be like to live in the world with those benefits. As you go about your daily life today, how might those personal benefits be shared with others? So they can benefit as well. May it be that this practice that we do benefits the world, those close to us, those not so close, those people we don't know, all beings. May all beings be happy. May all beings be safe. May all beings be peaceful. May all beings be free from all suffering. May beings be free of oppression, war, starvation, poverty. And may it be how we live this life of ours that we support these possibilities. May all beings be happy. So thank you all. And while I take a moment to drink my water, I'd be curious if some of you would put in the chat, what was beneficial or what was it like to spend the first few minutes of the meditation thinking in the way that I suggested? I'd like to maybe read a range of how it was. So thank you for those of you who put chats, and I read a good amount of them, but I'll when we finish, I'll read them all. I appreciate it. So now to give some context for that. So this week, I'm going to continue with the general topic of compassion that I've done the last number of weeks that I've been here. And kind of fill in some of the gaps from before. So I did, some weeks ago, I talked about 5 building blocks for compassion. And that all the building blocks ideally would be there when we act in the world compassionately or when we feel compassion. And so those are, 5 A's. So awareness, attunement, appreciation, aspiration, and action. And I did spend earlier, just a week before all that, a whole week on awareness, different ways of being aware, in preparation for looking at compassion. Today I'd like to talk about the second building block, which is attunement. And and as an introduction to this topic of compassion and attunement, I'd like to repeat something I've tried to say before, is that if we have just one mode of being compassionate, it's easy to be overwhelmed. It's easy for that mode to not be the appropriate mode for some situations we find ourselves in. Some people have never kind of considered what compassion is, never considered different modes and ways of being with suffering. Some people have only one mode of being with suffering. There's suffering in oneself, suffering in others, and it's overwhelming. Or it just kind of awakens all kinds of feelings of soreness, of overwhelm, of life is difficult, or I'm a victim, it's so hard for me, I don't know what to do, and this is too much, I don't feel safe. There's many kind of ways that people can be impacted by the presence of suffering. Some people rush to fix it. Sometimes the rush to fix the suffering in the world, suffering of others, is not really caring for others as it is trying to stop being uncomfortable oneself. They're trying to fix oneself by fixing others. And so there's many ways in which we can find ourselves in relationship to suffering. Some of them are not very healthy, and some of them are. Some of them we identify too much with the suffering, or we receive it or take it in such a way that we feel challenged by it, or feel like now we have even more suffering of our own. Especially if empathy is understood to be a plain and simple feeling what other people feel, then and it somehow ties into some previous suffering that we carry with ourselves. Feeling the suffering of others can trigger our own background and just cause everything to be so much more difficult. So the idea in understanding the different building blocks of compassion, the different aspects of compassion, is start having some agency in working with our minds, our hearts in such a way that we can be with suffering in a useful way, in a healthy way for ourselves and for others. And one of those ways is attunement. So to take time to attune ourselves to the suffering that we're encountering, suffering in ourselves or suffering in others. And as soon as we have the notion of we're doing something, attunement, there's a number of things that can happen. One is, what is attunement? The other is, now we're bringing some idea, some practice to bear, to address, to meet the suffering, which is just not just feeling the suffering in some kind of unmitigated way, or feeling the suffering in the old way in which we identify strongly with it, or the suffering touches our own wounds that we may be carrying. Now we're beginning to engage in agency, that, I have some ability to do something here, to question, to wonder, to look at. And this kind of rising to the occasion, rising to the occasion to meet it, we start bringing a um, kind of personal, I keep using the word agency, personal wherewithal, a personal involvement that's something different than just being impacted by the suffering or fixing the suffering. So just asking the question, what is attunement? So for this week, I'd like to offer 5 different aspects of that I think are important for this attunement, coming into harmony with the suffering, coming into a healthy balance in relationship to the suffering. And I have the acronym for touch for this. And it begins with thinking. And then openness to suffering. And then uprightness in relationship to suffering. And then communicating. That actually talking and communicating is an extremely important part of attunement. And then the last one is helping. That part of attunement is to figure out how we can be helpful or how we can serve the situation the best we can. And so the first one involves thinking. So again, this use of agency, like, okay, I'm encountering suffering. Maybe I feel it deeply, maybe I feel it in a moderate way or aware of it some way. Now let me think about it a little bit. How is this impacting me? What's a useful stance to be present for it? What background do I have that influences how I experience it and how I think I should address it and do something with it? Maybe I carry with me a sense of responsibility for everyone in my family or everyone in my neighborhood. And so when I encounter difficulty, it automatically means I have to do something to fix it. I have to solve the problem. And to begin thinking about this, is this really the case? Is there another way of being with this? Is there another way of experiencing it or understanding it? And for example, I'd like to propose that compassion has can have a very different quality if we read about suffering in the news or hear about suffering from the news, where it's far away, unconnected to us, versus being present for someone close to us who's suffering in some way, and we can feel and read them and know what's going on, know the context and the situation. In the news, we know so little about the context. We know so little about it all that there's a rush to relying on our thinking mind of what it means and what the opinions we have and the imagination about what this affects people. And so it's a kind of cognitive explosion that might not be the best source for compassion. It might be the best source for alarm. It might be the best source for anger, for distress. And those emotions can then get confused for compassion, or feel like, of course, this is part of compassion to have those. But to spend some time not just being mindful of the impact and how we're feeling, but to actually think it out. Because in our mindfulness tradition, we don't talk much about actively thinking, having critical thinking skills. It's easy to imagine that this practice of ours does not involve wise thinking. There's wise mindfulness, there's wise concentration that often is presented as a letting go of the thinking mind. And that can do us a disservice if we think that we're not supposed to think, or we become kind of lazy with the thinking mind. Thinking is a rich part of our life. It gets us in trouble, into big trouble at times, but thinking also is very helpful if we can think out, what does it mean to be attuned here? What is a certain kind of balanced way of being present for suffering? What is a way of being in harmony with it? Rushing to judgment is not harmony. Rushing to fixing is not harmony. Um, uh, uh, Immediately kind of feeling and getting preoccupied with the impact that the suffering has on us is not really in harmony. So what is it to be harmonious? Even just that question begins creating space, create a little bit of healthy distance maybe, and healthy receptivity. And so partly the part of this kind of ability to think about situations where suffering is involved is to think about the common responses that we have. Question them. Is this really the best way? Is this really wise? Is this really coming from some place of love or care, or is it appropriate for the situation? To think about a situation where there's suffering is to think about what's the context of this suffering, what's my role in it, and what's the role of other people, given the context, given the people who are suffering. Do I understand them well? Or am I projecting my own assumptions on them? I've sometimes had compassion for people suffering who were not suffering. But I've been in similar situations that they were in. And so I was kind of thinking, of course, they're going to have the bad experiences. One of the places I saw that was with my kids. When I had challenges in elementary school, I started at a lot of different schools growing up, so changed schools a lot. So kind of a new kid in the school, and questions of, for example, being accepted or being bullied or different things that were kind of a concern. And so, simplistically, to say it, like when my sons went into when I knew they were going to go into the playground, I had this concern for their well-being. They're certainly going to suffer. They're going to get the same experience. And so I wanted to intervene or say something, but it was all based on my own history, my own idea. There was no compassion needed. Some of the situations where I was so concerned, and it was more kind of legacy of my own challenges. So there's something about using the thinking mind to think out. Some people like to journal out, and really think what's going on here in some deeper, fuller way. That might not happen if we simply rely on our capacity to be mindful, to be aware. Let's just be aware here. Let me be aware. So to be attuned, the first element of attunement is thinking. Don't overthink, but don't underthink. So what I'd like to suggest for you is that you experiment today with this thinking aspect of attunement. If you find yourself in a situation where there's some suffering, your own or others, or something of challenge, don't rush to do something. Don't shut down. But go get a cup of coffee, go get a cup of tea or water, or go for a little walk, sit quietly if you can, excuse yourself to go to the bathroom to breathe for a little bit, and think it out. What's going on here, and what just happened, and what are some of the elements, contexts, and what does it mean to be attuned here? And one reference point for this attunement, how to be attuned, is ask yourself, kind of the exercise, how would you like other people to be attuned to you? Maybe then you can get some sense of what attunement means, what you can bring to others. And then have conversations with people today about what is attunement for you. It's not a common word, so maybe you're discovering together. What is it to be attuned to the suffering we encounter? So, thank you very much.